A man sits at a table. In front of him, a row of switches numbered up to 450 volts. In the next room, someone is screaming. He looks at the scientist beside him. The scientist says 4 words. Please continue. The experiment requires it. And he does. He is not a soldier. He has never hurt anyone. He came here today answering a newspaper ad for a memory study. He was paid $4.50. And right now, he believes he is electrocuting a stranger. He isn't. But he doesn't know that. And what he does next will become one of the most disturbing findings in the history of human psychology. Not because of what it says about him, because of what it says about you. In 1961, a psychologist at Yale University named Stanley Milgram wanted to answer a question that had been haunting the world since the end of World War II. The Nuremberg trials were over. The Nazi officers had sat in the dock and said the same thing, over and over. They were following orders. They had no choice. They were just doing what they were told. The world called it a lie, a convenient excuse. Milgram wasn't so sure. He wanted to know exactly how far an ordinary person would go if an authority figure told them to. So he built an experiment to find out. The setup was simple. 2 people were brought into a lab. One was assigned the role of teacher, the other was the learner. The learner was taken into a separate room and strapped into a chair with electrodes attached to their wrist. The teacher sat in front of a shock generator. 30 switches, 15 volts at the low end, 450 volts at the top, labeled simply XXX. The teacher's job was to read out pairs of words. If the learner got one wrong, the teacher had to administer a shock. And with every wrong answer, the voltage went up. What the teacher didn't know was that the learner was an actor. The shocks weren't real. The screams coming through the wall were a recording. The entire experiment was designed not to test the learner's memory. It was designed to test the teacher's obedience. At 75 volts, the learner grunted. At 120 volts, he shouted that the shocks were painful. At 150 volts, he demanded to be released. The teacher could hear all of this. He was sitting 3 feet from the wall. At 285 volts, he let out what Milgram's notes described as an agonized scream. At 300 volts, he went completely silent. And that silence was somehow worse than the screaming. And whenever the teacher hesitated or turned to ask if they should stop, the scientist in the room gave one of 4 scripted responses. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue. That was it. No threats, no punishment for stopping, just a calm voice and a white lab coat. Before Milgram ran the experiment, he asked a group of psychiatrists to predict the results. They estimated that fewer than 1% of participants would go all the way to 450 volts. They said only someone with a serious psychological disorder would deliver the maximum shock to a silent, motionless stranger. 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts. Not 1 in 100, nearly 2 in 3. Teachers, postal workers, engineers, men who had families waiting at home, men who laughed nervously or sweated through their shirts or begged the scientist to let them stop, and then kept going anyway. Milgram ran the experiment over and over. He changed the variables. He moved it out of Yale's prestigious campus and into a rundown commercial building to remove the institutional authority. Still, over 47% went to 450 volts. He put the teacher in the same room as the learner, close enough to see their face. The rate dropped, but it didn't stop. In every version, in every setting, across hundreds of participants, the same pattern held. Most people, when told to continue by someone who seemed to be in charge, continued. So why? What was actually happening inside those people? The answer isn't that they were monsters. The answer is that they were human. And humans are wired in a way that made perfect sense for most of our history, and makes deeply uncomfortable sense right now. For the vast majority of human existence, authority meant survival. You lived in a group. The group had a structure. Someone knew where the water was. Someone knew which plants would kill you. Someone knew when to move camp and which direction to go. Defying that person wasn't just socially awkward. It could get you and everyone around you killed. Your brain evolved inside that world. It developed a deep, automatic deference to perceived authority. Not a conscious decision. A reflex. A system that kicks in before you've even had time to think about whether the authority in front of you actually knows what it's doing. Milgram called it the agentic state. The moment a person stops thinking of themselves as a responsible individual making choices and starts thinking of themselves as an instrument of someone else's will. The man at the switches wasn't asking himself whether this was right. He was asking himself whether he was following the procedure correctly. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The people who kept going to 450 volts weren't comfortable. They weren't enjoying it. Many of them were visibly distressed, hands trembling, voices cracking, asking over and over if they should stop. One participant had a full seizure. Milgram had to halt the session. But distress didn't stop them. The white coat kept them going. Milgram wrote afterward that the most dangerous thing his experiment revealed was not cruelty. It was the capacity of ordinary, decent people to set aside their own moral judgment the moment someone with apparent authority told them the situation required it. He called it the most fundamental lesson of his study, that ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. That sentence was written in 1974. It has not aged, because the white coat never went away. It just changed shape. Today it's a title, a verified checkmark, a confident voice behind a microphone with 3 million followers. The specific costume is different, the mechanism is identical. Your brain still reads authority the same way it did in that Yale laboratory. It still hands over the controls under the right conditions. It still looks for someone who seems to know what they're doing and thinks, they probably have a reason. The people who went all the way to 450 volts were not uniquely obedient. They were not broken or cowardly or cruel. They were average, completely, unremarkably average. That was Milgram's point. That was always his point. The question he was really asking was never, how evil can people be? It was, how easily can ordinary people be made to act against everything they believe, simply because someone in the room looked like they were supposed to be in charge? And the answer, tested across hundreds of people, in multiple countries, replicated by researchers for the next 60 years, is very easily. Now go back to the room, the man at the table, the row of switches, the screaming that has stopped. He looks at his hands, he looks at the scientist, he is sweating. He does not want to be here. He wants someone to tell him it's okay to stop. Nobody does. So he reaches for the next switch. He is not a monster. He is the average result of an experiment run on human nature itself. And if you had been sitting in that chair, the data says you probably would have been too. Not because you're weak, not because you're evil, but because the part of your brain that decides whether to follow an instruction is older than language, older than morality, older than your ability to reason your way out of a room. The experiment ended in 1962. The question it raised never did. And if you've never heard of Milgram before today, that might be the most important thing worth sitting with. Because the experiments that reveal the most uncomfortable things about human nature are almost never the ones anyone wants to talk about. This channel exists for exactly those ones.